Welcome to the Okayama University Japan Times SDG Virtual Global Circuit Academic Seminar organized by the Institute of Global Human Resource Development. I'm Professor Nobuyuki Kambara, and I will be your host. This webinar series covers topics related to Japanese culture or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and sometimes both. We hope the broad range of topics will appeal to a wide audience and generate discussion and new ways of thinking. Let me address a couple of technical issues before we start. There will be a time for questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask your questions two ways. You can unmute your microphone, or you can type your question into the chat function in Zoom. Please keep your microphone muted until the end when the question and answer time begins. Please be aware that there is a function called Q&A. However, please don't use that one because we will only be checking the chat function. Also, please select all panelists and audiences in the drop box of your chat function. This way, everyone able to see the questions that are being asked. It will also make it easier to understand the context of answers that are given. Tonight's presentation is called Intercultural Competency from a Sociolinguistic Perspective. How shall we reconnect the world? Our speaker is Judith Kambara. Judith Kambara is a specially appointed lecturer at Okayama Prefectural University. She is a US licensed teacher and has a master's degree in applied linguistics from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She has been teaching for 12 years and has taught social studies and language arts in international schools in Okinawa and Kyoto, as well as English as a foreign language at Japanese universities. She believes that social studies concepts are at the heart of every academic discipline. Her research and classroom practice focus on weaving issues of equity and human rights into the curriculum and using students' passions and interests to facilitate learning. At this time, I'll turn it over to Judy Kambara.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Before I start sharing my slides, I want to put a link into the chat box. So if you check your chat box, there's a link there. And this is a link to a Google Doc that I want to use later a couple of times during the presentation. I'll ask you to put some responses in. Don't do anything to it now, but it's a good idea to go ahead and access it. Anybody with the link can edit it. So when it's time, I'll ask you to write some responses on the Google Doc. And this way your answers might be a little bit more anonymous. And then if you have trouble accessing the Google Doc, you can put your answers in chat, but I'll tell you more about that when we get to that point. So I see a couple of people have accessed it. Looks like somebody else is on, so that's good. When we get there, let me know if you have any trouble or you can use the chat box. Okay, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So give me a couple of seconds to do that. And let's see if this works. And I hope you can see my first slide. I think you can. Okay, and let me put this chat box over here where it's out of my way for now. Okay, so I am Judy Kambara, and I'll be talking to you today about intercultural communication and intercultural competence. Now, due to COVID-19, we've probably felt that we've been more disconnected during the past year, but actually we're becoming more connected, especially virtually. To travel and study abroad, it used to be necessary to have time and especially the money to physically travel to another country and to live there for some extended time for study or business. However, COVID-19 has pushed us into the virtual age as never before. And we're discovering that we actually have more opportunities to reach out and study and collaborate with international partners. And this webinar is a prime example of that. Some of you may be students or teachers from partner universities. And if COVID-19 were not happening right now, you might have been here in Okayama right now studying at Okayama University. Others who are here might be Okayama students or teachers, and you might have been abroad at partner universities or attending international conferences at this time if COVID-19 were not happening. And we might also have some people from the community, either in Okayama or other parts of Japan or abroad present. And although you can't see one another, you'll be able to hear and see each other's voices and questions through the chat and the microphone functions later. And in this way, we're able to share information and thoughts with many more people than might have been possible in a traditional setting like we had before COVID-19. In fact, in a traditional situation, most of you would have been in different places at different times. So it's very possible that your paths would never have crossed. So it's very exciting that we can be together this way. And because we're becoming so much more connected, intercultural competence is becoming increasingly important. Well, next I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. Actually, kind of a lot about myself, and there's a reason for this, and it has to do with cultural identity. So I hope you'll see where this fits together later. So this is my education and experience, and I call this also it's my professional identity. We're going to talk today about cultures, subcultures, and identities. And the main reason I'm showing this is to help you understand where I'm coming from and what shapes my thinking as an educator in this presentation. It's like my cultural background as a teacher. It explains why I think what I think and why I do what I do, just as the culture of countries and the places that we come from shapes our behavior and thinking. So I studied Asian studies to begin with because I was very interested in East Asian cultures and politics, especially as it relates to Okinawa, where I was living at the time. And I lived there for 14 years. And then soon after I got my degree, I did a lot more coursework to get my US teacher's license in social studies first. Then I added language arts a year later. And just a note about these terms, because I'm speaking from a US perspective, when I say language arts, language arts means the study of your native language. In Japanese, it's called kokugo. And it's learning the grammar and the writing skills, and it's reading literature and poetry, and etc. for students who already speak that language so that they can use it effectively in school and for other purposes. And you do that all through, from elementary school through high school and on into university. In the US, it's often just called English class. And maybe that is the case in other English-speaking countries too. But language arts has nothing to do with teaching people how to speak English. And I'm also a licensed social studies teacher in the US. And social studies teachers in the US have to be able to teach US history, world history, geography, which is physical geography, human geography, environmental geography, political science, psychology, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, and economics. So if you're a social studies teacher, you could find yourself teaching any of these subjects as a required course or an elective. Now, I spent many years thinking that I didn't like social studies because when I was in junior high and high school, my perception of social studies was American history. And I didn't do that well in American history in high school because when I was in high school, it was all about memorizing a lot of names and dates. But later I learned that it can be and should be much more than that. But I found out that I loved psychology when I took it as an elective in high school. And after I started college, I began to realize that I was fascinated with people and cultures. So I found out that I did like social studies after all. And my very favorite areas of social studies deal with sociology and cultural anthropology. Later, I got a master's in applied linguistics, and I now teach English as a foreign language at a Japanese university. But it turns out that applied linguistics isn't just teaching people how to speak English. And some people think that's what it's all about, but it's not. It deals with all kinds of things from inputting language into computers to make translation software. And that's really cool, but it's kind of difficult for me to understand deeply. So that's not my area. We also have to study psycholinguistics, and that deals with all of the language theories and what's happening inside people's minds when they're learning their first and second languages. And that's pretty important for understanding what my students who are learning to speak English might be going through. And the area of linguistics that I'm most drawn to is sociolinguistics, because this area intersects really nicely with my interest in social studies. This area looks at how people use language in relation to social factors, such as their ethnic origin, national culture, their age, their gender, their sexual identity, educational level, social class, and so on. And we'll talk about some of these things when we're exploring what you already know about intercultural communication. Now, I've been a teacher for 12 years, but I feel like I kind of have a dual identity as a teacher. I've taught language arts and social studies in junior high school, in international schools in Okinawa and mainland Japan. But I also teach English as a foreign language in Japanese universities. And the expectations for each type of teaching are different. And I've switched from one to the other 3 times now. So I went from teaching junior high language arts and social studies in Okinawa to teaching university English as a foreign language in Niigata, back to teaching junior high language arts and social studies in Kyoto, and now teaching English as a foreign language again in Okayama. And each time I switch from one to the other, I always feel like I'm starting over a bit and I need to relearn some things and kind of have to reinvent myself. Maybe it's a little bit like switching cultures or the kind of culture shock we experience. But I love social studies, and I really think it's the basis for everything. And I also don't want to lose contact with teaching it, so I always try to find a way to weave social studies concepts like intercultural and interpersonal relationships, peace, human rights, non-discrimination, and sustainability into my English as foreign language lessons. Okay, so that's me professionally. Let me give you a look at who I am personally. These are some of my groups and identities. These are also called subcultures, and they can be called speech communities when we're talking about linguistics, and we'll get into that a bit more later. And because of this, I interact with a lot of different people. So I'm a teacher. I'm a mom. I have 2 adult children, a daughter and a son. And so my experiences as a parent are different than, they're much the same as some of my other mom friends, but they're also different. I have at least 2 friends who have 3 sons. One friend has 3 adult sons and one friend has 3 teenage sons, and their experience as moms are much different than my experience as a mom, but we share some things too, and we talk about things in a special way when we're together. I'm an animal lover, cat owner, or maybe the cat owns me. I'm American. I'm from Northwest Florida, which is a different culturally from the rest of Florida. I'm from an area in the United States called the South, and we have a particular way of speaking and behaving in the South than other parts of the United States, just like other parts of the United States have their own particular way of speaking and behaving. I'm married to a Japanese citizen. I live in Japan, so I don't live in my home country. I spent 14 years in Okinawa, and I've been in mainland Japan for 10 years. I wrote here that I wrote Okinawan Asa and taiko drummer dancer for 10 years. I did and do sometimes when I go back, 2 different styles of Okinawa dance and drumming. Asa is a type of dance that's done during Obon season to honor ancestors in Okinawa, and it's completely different from the Japanese style bon dance. And taiko drumming is in Okinawa is very different from taiko drumming in mainland Japan. Instead of standing and playing a drum, you hold your drum or you wear your drum if it's a large drum, and you, in both styles, you drum and dance at the same time. I'm a hobbyist photographer. I'm a musician. I've played clarinet since junior high school. I can play Okinawa sanshin. The sanshin is a 3-stringed instrument. If you know what the Japanese shamisen is, the sanshin is the instrument that came to Japan and became the Japanese shamisen. I took up ukulele last year, and I'm not very good, but it brings me some joy. And I've got a question mark beside guitar. I have a guitar, but I need to work on that. I'm a language learner, still working on Japanese. I'm a daughter, I'm an aunt, I'm a sister, I'm an eldest child. I have a younger brother, and since I'm the eldest child, of course, that makes me the most important, right? Well, that's what I think. I'm a straight white female, and there are probably many, many more identities that I have. But those are going to become important when we talk about subcultures and speech groups. And because I'm part of all these different groups, I might interact with different people and use different words and behave in different ways depending on which group I'm with. And we probably talk about different things in different groups. We're going to talk about your groups, your identities, subcultures, speech communities, many different names for this. We'll talk about this in a bit, so please start thinking about what kinds of different groups you belong to. Okay, let's dive right into talking about culture. So what is culture? There are several definitions, and I like this one by Hofstede. And Hofstede says, culture is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from others. Now, this phrase, programming of the mind, is important because people who belong to certain cultures think and behave in certain ways that are different from other cultures. But this isn't something we really do consciously. So let's test that out. I want you to access the Google Doc now. Here's the link again, but the link is also in the chat. If you, again, well, let me explain. I want you to look at, in the Google Doc, there's a box at the top that says number 1, describe your own culture. And I have written there American culture, Japanese culture, Canadian culture, but there, I'm sure are some other cultures here. So if you don't see your culture, type your culture inside the box. So maybe you need to type Korean culture or Chinese culture or some other culture there. And then just beside your culture, describe your culture. What are some words or phrases that would describe your culture? If you can type on the Google Doc, do that. Your answers are anonymous there. But if you can't type on the Google Doc, you can type in the chat box and I'll check your answers in the chat box. So you have 2 places. I'm going to give you about a minute or so to type in whatever comes to mind. Describe your culture. And again, if there are other cultures here besides American, Japanese, and Canadian, please feel free to add that at the bottom. Good. If you type in the chat, make sure you set your setting to all panelists and attendees so everybody can see. I'm checking that too. Gonna give you about 30 more seconds. Okay, great. Okay, so let's check the answers. And all right, let's take a look at the answers. So some people typed in for American culture, we've got jazz, rhythm and blues, so a couple of music styles there, nature loving, freedom, people from diverse backgrounds, okay? For Japanese people, Japanese culture, we've got Shinto God, Buddhism, Confucianism, local festivals, temples, respect nature, Sado, which Japanese tea ceremony, right? Manga, anime, ikebana, sake, shochu, izakayas, not talkative. Okay, good. And then for Canadian culture, known for multiculturalism, liberal ideals, inclusivity, less known for Indigenous cultures and colonization of Indigenous nations, government based on Christian white settler ideals, but there are many cultures, religions, and languages that exist there. Okay, good, you've got good answers. Now, was that easy or difficult? just kind of in the chat box, just type the word easy or difficult. Is it easy or difficult to describe your culture, especially in 2 minutes? I want to see what you think. So type that in the chat. Difficult, extremely difficult, not easy. Okay, yeah, I agree. It's not easy to do this because we don't think about this consciously. Okay, so that's a good start. Let's go to the next one. All right. Often, so exploring culture more. When people think about culture, they're mostly thinking about objective culture. And I noticed that a lot of the things you typed into the box there were objective culture, and that's normal. Those are the things we think of most. What is objective culture? And I know that it's probably hard for you to read all the tiny print on this slide, but that's okay. We don't have to know all of that. That's not what's important. I just wanted to show you an example of a site that is promoting Japanese culture. There's nothing wrong with this website. I chose it randomly. It seems like a perfectly good site to use if you want to get some overall information about Japan for a trip, or if you're just curious about Japan. And I use sites like this all the time when I'm traveling. And they listed a lot of things that you listed about Japan. I can't even read the small print right now, but we've got, let me see, there's religion, there's tea, there's food, there's sports, I think, there's geisha, there's manga. So all of these things, cherry blossoms, okay? These are, what I want you to notice though, this information deals with objective elements of culture. Now, objective elements of culture are the things in a culture, like historical events, people, literature, language, music and the arts, places, the dress, what people wear, the food that they eat, and etc. Mainly objective elements of culture are the things, as I said, that we find in a culture. So we can say that objective culture is the what of a culture. But objective culture doesn't necessarily give us a deep understanding of a culture. It's subjective culture that helps us understand cultures deeply. And what is subjective culture? This is where we're talking about that phrase, collective programming of the mind, that we saw in the definition of culture a few slides back. Trianda said that it's society's characteristic way of perceiving its social environment. And it's the unstated assumptions and standard operating procedures of a culture. Subjective culture is the underlying ideas, assumptions, beliefs, and values about those things that we said were objective culture, such as history, religion, arts, and food. So it's what people think, believe, and feel about everything. For example, how people should dress, what is good or bad behavior, what is the meaning of freedom and individualism, what's our relationship with that, what do we think, what's the role of the law, what's the role of education, what are people's attitudes about sex, family, relationships, and anything else you can think of that exists in a culture. So in other words, objective culture is the what of a culture, and subjective culture is the why about a culture. And we need to understand the why in order to understand the what. Some characteristics of culture. It is learned. For example, we learn culture through folk tales, stories, proverbs, music and art, the mass media. It is shared by members of the culture. It is transmitted to future generations. In fact, it must be in order to survive. It's based on symbols, and these symbols can be anything from flags to religious icons or other images. But the most important symbol we have in culture is language. And this includes nonverbal language and gestures. We'll talk about this more. Culture is dynamic. It evolves over time and changes due to history. It is an integrated system. So all of the parts of culture are interrelated. Now, I think the proverbs are really interesting, so I'm going to share a few of these with you. We said that culture is learned and transmitted to next generations, and one way that happens is through proverbs or sayings that cultures have. Proverbs are a window into a culture's worldview and attitudes towards a lot of things, such as education, the law, business, marriage, and etc. And so I've listed a few here. This first group up at the top has to do with how cultures view speech and the use of words. So at the top, we have two proverbs from the US. The first one says, "The squeaky wheel gets the grease." This shows the importance of being direct, speaking up, and expressing your viewpoints, maybe telling people when you need something. The second one is "get to the point." This one shows that communication is important, and it's important to transmit information clearly with your words. So you shouldn't waste time maybe talking about unrelated things. Get to the point. Here's some other proverbs. A saying in some Arab cultures goes like this: "A man's tongue is his sword." And according to my sources, in Arab cultures, they're taught to use words forcefully. And in addition, there's a strong oral tradition of storytelling in Arab cultures. So when people are transmitting information, there's a lot of description is used. Even in business situations, this is quite common. Meanwhile, in East Asian cultures that have a strong Confucian cultural connection, silence can be valued over speech. We see this in this proverb from the Analects of Confucius, and it says, "Those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know." The second group of proverbs deals with taking action versus accepting situations as they are. Two proverbs from the US are here. One says, "Strike while the iron is hot." This one transmits the idea of taking action quickly. The next one, "Take the bull by the horns," transmits the idea of taking control of difficult situations. However, in some cultures, it's important to accept fate or accept situations as they are rather than trying to control them. For example, in many Asian cultures, a saying goes, "One does not make the wind, but is blown by it." A Mexican proverb says, "I dance to the tune that is played." And the Maasai people in Africa have a saying that says, "A zebra does not despise its stripes." So acceptance rather than trying to fight situations. The last group of proverbs down here shows how some cultures view individualism or collectivism. Two proverbs from the US are here. The first one said, "God helps those who help themselves." And the second one says, "Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps." And these show a strong individualist attitude. You need to do things yourself. But the Ethiopian proverb, When spider webs unite, they can tie up a lion, shows the value of collectivist thought, working together. So we see some examples here of how proverbs transmit ideas and beliefs from one generation to the next. Now, let's start talking about intercultural communication. What is it? Intercultural communication is interaction between people whose ideas, customs, and social behavior are different enough to change the way in which they communicate with each other. And this happens anytime a member of one culture communicates with a member of another culture. Okay, let's keep moving on. And what is this term, intercultural competence? Well, there are several definitions of intercultural competence, but I like this one. It's an adaptation from an article written by Lung, Ang, and Tan, and it's used on the Monash University website. And it says that intercultural competence is the ability to function effectively across cultures, to think and act appropriately, and to communicate and work with people from different cultural backgrounds at home or abroad. Now, okay, this is Deerdorf's process model of intercultural competence. Darla Deerdorf is a big researcher in the area of intercultural competence. So if you want to know more about that, should read her work, definitely. Let's take a look at this process model. There are a lot of different models of intercultural competence, but I like this one. Okay, we're going to start up here on the left, the upper left, and it starts at the individual level. So we see individual here, and it starts with attitudes. So we need to have attitudes of respect and value for other cultures. We need to have openness toward other cultures, and that is not being judgmental about what is different. And this is a big point because it's human nature to view things through our own cultural lens. After all, we do view the world through our own cultures, but we have to be careful not to judge other cultures based on our own culture. That's called ethnocentrism. And then another thing we need to do is be curious. We need to have curiosity and want to discover about other cultures. Then as we develop these attitudes, we begin, let's move over here, we begin to acquire knowledge and comprehension. And we begin to develop cultural self-awareness. So that's the knowledge that our own culture influences our behavior, and the knowledge that of how we have been influenced by our own culture. I mean, really, how often do we think about how our own culture influences our behavior? Usually we're trying to figure out, we're too busy trying to figure out other people and other cultures. So it's probably rare that we think about our own cultures and their influence upon ourselves. So when we develop this cultural awareness, we gain deep cultural knowledge and sociolinguistic awareness. That is, so sociolinguistic awareness is important in this discussion because that's how language and culture influence each other. And it's how different groups use language for different purposes and how we behave in different groups. And we begin to develop the skills, Deerdorf says, to listen, to observe, to evaluate, analyze, interpret, and relate to our own culture, and then to relate to other cultures. And as we develop this, we begin to see some desired internal outcomes. So things that are happening inside us. And the desired internal outcomes of this knowledge is, or in other words, what happens in our mind is a person who is more informed, and very importantly, a person who has a shift in their frame of reference. And when people shift their frame of reference, they develop an ethno-relative view. Now, that's opposite of ethnocentrism, where you're judging other people from your own culture. So in other words, rather than viewing other cultures and from the viewpoint of your own culture and perhaps judging them, we become able to look at situations and behaviors from the perspective of the other person's culture. So instead of thinking that a cultural practice is strange, we start to come to understand why people might do or say the things they do. And we develop empathy, adaptability, and flexibility, and being able to think and do things differently than we would in our own culture. And let me give you an example of that that I read in the book called I Am Malala. Malala Yousafzai was the girl, or she's a young woman now, from Afghanistan, who was shot by the Taliban because she spoke out in favor of girls' schooling. And Malala so she's from Afghanistan, and she's part of the Pashtun ethnic group. And in this book, Malala gives lots of explanations, lots of insights into Pashtun culture. And I'm going to read you a section from the book, a very small section where she tells a small story. She's telling a larger story, but then she gives us an insight as to why Pashtuns rarely say thank you. So she was telling a story about conflict. Her father used to mediate a lot of conflicts between families in their village. And she said in Pashtun culture, people, revenge is common. People have a lot of conflicts. So her father would do a lot to help people mediate their conflicts. And so she was explaining that story, and she ends it by telling this small story. She said, and she starts with a proverb, "We are a people of many sayings. One is, the stone of Pashto does not rust in water," which means we neither forget nor forgive. That's also why we rarely say thank you, and the word is manana. She said, it's because we believe that a Pashtun will never forget a good deed and is bound to reciprocate at some point, just as he will a bad one. Kindness can only be repaid with kindness. It can't be repaid with expressions like thank you. So in Pashtun culture, according to Malala Yousafzai, saying thank you, just saying a couple of words would be considered insufficient as a way to show your gratitude for a great kindness that someone has done for you. Instead, you would repay that kindness with a kindness at some point later. Now, imagine if you had encountered a situation where you did something kind for a friend or an acquaintance of yours who is from the Pashtun culture, but you had not reached this point in Deerdorf's process model where you have this understanding that other cultures probably do things differently. So you do something nice for your Pashtun friend, but they didn't say thank you to you. And in your culture, saying thank you is very important. You may say to yourself, I did this nice thing for this person, but they didn't even say thank you. How rude. Well, you may be thinking only from your own cultural perspective rather than from theirs. Now, if you have reached this point in Deardorff's cultural process model, you don't have to know everything about Pashtun culture. You don't have to be able to say, oh, Pashtuns don't say thank you very often because, well, we can't know everything about all cultures. But when you undergo a frame of reference shift, like Deardorff is talking about here, then you'll be more likely to guess that there's probably some cultural reason that your Pashtun friend didn't say thank you, even if you don't understand everything about Pashtun culture. So once an individual has reached this desired outcome, internal outcome, they begin to carry out effective and appropriate communication in intercultural situations when they interact with others. And so the cycle goes around and round. Okay. So Deardorff says that when we develop cultural self-awareness, we develop sociolinguistic awareness. And that leads to skills of being able to listen, observe, evaluate, analyze, interpret, and relate. And these skills are necessary for effective intercultural communication. Well, most people already know a great deal about intercultural communication and competence, but you may not realize what you already know. We're going to zoom in now and find out what you already know about intercultural competence and communication. A good place to start is by understanding that you have membership in different linguistic and cultural groups in your own society. Some people may say different linguistic groups in my own society, but I'm Japanese and we're all Japanese and we all speak Japanese. Or, you know, even some Americans may say, but we're Americans. Well, no matter what culture you come from, you have a great deal of cultural and linguistic diversity, even among the people who are most like you. This means that you're already aware of some things that are necessary for intercultural competence. Okay, so let's keep looking closer. Here's my slide again showing my different groups and identities. Right now, I'd like for you to think about some different groups and identities that you belong to. Please access that Google Doc again. And on the Google Doc, and so the link is in the chat. I see some of you are on there. On the Google Doc, there's a box 2, and it says, what speech communities do you belong to? Now I've got, let me see, how many people are here? Let's take a look. 11 participants, so that means we've got 9 participants plus 2 panelists. Okay, so I've got person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4. We can add, we can person 5, person 6, person 7. So feel free to get on that Google Doc and add another person. So each one of you this time is going to be a different person. You don't have to put your name. Please write down a few groups or identities, groups that you belong to or identities that you feel you have. Okay, there you go. And I'll give you a minute or 2 to do that. And if it's difficult for you to get on the Google Doc and you would like to put some answers in chat, then you can do that. And I will paste the Google Doc link again in chat, just so it's nice and fresh at the bottom for everybody. Okay, about 30 seconds. And if you can't use the Google Sites, if you want to type any of your answers into the chat box, I'll check those. So feel free to do that if you'd like. Okay, let's take a look at these answers that we've got. Person 2, we've got teacher, father, son, American, straight male, Spanish speaker, classical singer, bicyclist, traveler, Oregonian, New Yorker, Okayama local. Wow, so 3 different locations. Nature lover, model UN. Person 3, mother, daughter, 25 years in Okayama. Okayama University, musical, not athletic, Hiroshima. Person 5, teacher, mother, daughter, sister, belly dancer, wife, daughter-in-law, resident of Hiroshima, resident of Okayama, Californian, Japanese American. Person 6 is a student, sister, daughter, live in Okayama alone, music lover. Person 7, teacher, researcher, nature lover, deadhead. If you're deadhead, it means you like an old rock group called the Grateful Dead. A global citizen, army brat. That means that your parents were in the a parent was in the military. An expat, upstate New Yorker. Person 9, teacher, elementary and high school, professor, white, woman, Canadian, queer, daughter, sister, auntie, Japanese learner, working class background, currently middle class, able-bodied, Okayama City, meditator, and no religion. Okay, these are great, and it shows so many different groups and identities. If you just think of each person individually, look how many identities and groups that you belong to. Okay, let's keep on going. Keep these in mind, and let's continue. Okay, we're going to begin by talking about language, and then we're going to progress from there. Let me just make sure that I didn't skip a slide. No, I didn't. Okay, so what is language? Language is that code that we use to communicate. And the code is made of words and grammar that we use to put the words together so that they make sense when we say them. And the words in a language point to meanings of things, ideas, and feelings, etc. For example, in English, the word car is that metal thing with 4 wheels and an engine that I drive when I want to go somewhere. But in Japanese, the word is kuruma. And language includes spoken language, so the words we say, written language, the words we write, signed language, for example, deaf or hard of hearing people often speak with their hands. Language also includes gestures, the movements that we make with our hands or body that have meaning. And language is one of the most important elements of culture, and it's one of the most important methods for transmitting culture because it allows members of the culture to share feelings, ideas, and information. Okay, now we're getting into those groups. Within each culture, there are various subcultures. And there are various subcultures in every larger culture. Subcultures can be based on many things, and many of you listed these things here. They can be based on gender, physical type. In fact, somebody listed able-bodied. The neighborhood you're from, a standard of living, religion or no religion, occupation, activities you're involved in, the region you're from, and so many more, as we can see from your list on the Google Doc. So think about your own list of subcultures and think about your relation to your overall culture, whether you're Canadian or American or Japanese or Chinese or some other culture. The people in all of these different subcultures that you belong to share the same overall culture, such as being French or Japanese or American. We are all members of various subcultures. And these groups that you listed are some of your subcultures. And each of the subcultures that you belong to differs. They differ in the way that people act, in the things that they do, the types of speech they use, and or the things that they talk about. And members of different subcultures will adjust their ways of being, doing, acting, and speaking, depending on which group they happen to be with at the time. Okay, we said that members of different subcultures change the way they behave and speak, depending on who they're with. So, and they don't usually mix them. So, and we're going to get into that. So let's talk about speech communities. Well, I'm starting to change terminologies here, but really subcultures and speech communities are pretty much the same thing. But when we're looking at subcultures from a linguistics perspective, we start calling them speech communities, basically. So they're basically the same. So when I'm talking about speech communities and subcultures, I'm not talking about people who speak different languages. For example, people who speak English or Japanese or Spanish, although these can be speech communities. But right now we're talking about this in the context of people who speak the same language and share the same overall culture, but have different subcultures, okay? So every speech community or every subculture that you belong to has a different language, and I've got that in quotation marks. It's a different language, words you use, or way of communicating. For example, members of a soccer team use different words with their teammates than people who practice ballet use with their fellow dancers, even though they may speak the same language, for example, English or Spanish in both places. Earlier, I told you that I'm a university teacher and that I do photography as a hobby. So these are two of my subcultures. But I don't use photography words with my work colleagues unless I know that my work colleague also does photography. So let's imagine that I'm showing one of my work colleagues who doesn't know anything about photography, some of my photos that I took, and they ask me, how did you make the subject of the photo really, really clear, but the background is blurry? How did you do that? Well, I can't say, I used a small f-stop to get a large aperture in order to get shallow depth of field. If I say that, my work colleague won't have any idea what I'm talking about because I'm using words that photographers know, but not everybody else does. What I need to say is that I changed the settings on my camera to let more light come through the lens when I take the photo, and that makes the background blurry, but the subject stays sharp. And you probably speak differently when you're with close friends than when you're with your work colleagues, and maybe differently than when you're speaking with your teachers or with your students, and differently than when you're speaking maybe to your parents. So we all use different language and even level of formality, depending on which group we're with at the time, and we don't usually mix these. All people are members of several speech communities and subcultures. For example, some soccer players also do ballet, and they would use different language and behave differently depending on which group they're with. Another characteristic of speech communities is that the role of members is different in each speech community or subculture. So if, let's imagine that John is a soccer player, but he also does ballet. John might be the captain of the soccer team, but he might not be the top dancer in his ballet troupe. And finally, each speech community or subculture has a different way of being and views the world in different ways. So soccer players might view the world through the lens of competition and teamwork, but ballet dancers might also view it through a lens of teamwork, but they might also view the world through music and beauty. Okay, let's take it a step further. Let's take it from to more closer to intercultural communication. Communication is more than just words. Sometimes we tend to focus on the words, but it's not just what you say, it's also how you say it and how you do it. So language and behavior go hand in hand with intercultural communication. Not only is language different for each speech community or subculture, behavior is also different in each group. It's important to say the right things and to behave in the right way, depending on the group you're with. And I think you all know that, but let me tell you a story. James Paul G., who is an American linguistics professor, gives an excellent example of this in one of the articles I read. And I'm going to paraphrase the story that he said to illustrate this. But the story goes like this. He said, imagine that you decide you want to go to a bar to have a drink. And you walk into a bar and it's a rough, tough bar, and rough, tough people go there. Maybe there's fighting and things like that happen in this bar sometimes. You're dressed in a designer suit. You find a seat, and you pull out your handkerchief and you dust off the seat and you sit down and you look across the room and you say, "Oh, bartender, may I have the wine list, please?" Well, you're speaking the same language as the other people in the bar. And the bartender definitely understood what you said, but your way of saying it and your way of being and your way of doing are all wrong for this situation. On the other hand, you're going into the rough, tough bar. If you walk in wearing jeans and a t-shirt and you walk up to the bar and you say, "Give me a beer, will ya?" Now you're saying and you're being and you're doing all match the situation and you fit in a little bit better. So now let's imagine that you are John, the soccer player, who also does ballet. Will you use the same words or behave in the same way or move your body in the same way in the ballet studio as you do on the soccer field? What would happen if you did? and your fellow dance troupe members will probably look at you a little bit strangely. And if you do the same thing on the soccer field, if you're moving like a ballet dancer, your soccer player friends are wondering what's wrong with you. But if John, the soccer player ballet dancer, has any intercultural competence at all, he will adjust his speech as well as his behavior according to his situation. And most everybody already does this, and we know it and we do it. That's why I said that you already know more about intercultural communication and competence than you probably think you do. So therefore, we can see it's possible to know the grammar and words of a language perfectly, but not communicate well with others because your understanding of how to behave in the situation is all wrong. And so, as we said, language is a very important element of culture, but it's not the only element of culture. And simply knowing another language doesn't mean you automatically have intercultural competence. So these are some things to think about. We thought about your subcultures, speech communities you belong to. How do you behave and speak in these groups? Is the way you speak and behave different for each group? Let's continue. Now, okay, we zoomed in, we looked closely at your subcultures. Now let's zoom out and look at intercultural competence, looking at other large cultures. Okay, since most of you already know that different subcultures behave in different ways, most people know this, so most people know how to make shifts in language and behavior when they move between groups. And they understand that other people have other ways of speaking and behaving than they do. So we're zooming out to look at larger cultures, so maybe American, Japanese, Canadian, and whatever other cultures we can think of. And let's look at a few types of cultures and their communication styles that are different. Now notice that I said types of cultures. So I'm not going to focus on any one specific nationality here. I'm going to give you examples of culture types and then some examples of some nationalities that fit into those culture types. Some nationalities share some culture types and some will share others. There are many ways to talk about cultural types and communication styles. And when looking at intercultural communication, some researchers have looked at things like how cultures view power distance, how they view masculinity, femininity, how they view time, like the past, present, and future, how they're oriented with that, whether cultures are being cultures or doing cultures. We'd need an entire semester to look at cultures from all the different ways we could look at them. But so tonight, I'm going to introduce 3 value orientations. And after that, I'm going to talk about some conversation styles and compare them to sports. So let's start with the value orientations. The first one I want to look at is high context and low context cultures. Now, I always get confused with these two terms, so let me explain it. High context cultures already have a lot of context or background information built into their culture about their culture. That's why they say they're high context. There's a lot of background information. In low context cultures, there's not as much background information built into the culture. And this has to do with how similar the backgrounds of the people in the culture are and how much shared history they have. So let's look at each one. I'm going to start on the left side and I'll talk about characteristics of culture and communication style. Then I'll go to the right and talk about each one. And then I'll talk about misunderstandings, possible misunderstandings. So high context cultures, some examples are Japanese culture, Chinese culture, Korean, Native American cultures, Latin American cultures, and Arab cultures. And of course, there are more. These cultures tend to be homogeneous. That means they have similar backgrounds and experiences. There has been little change in history over time, and little change in traditions over time. Their conversations and actions as a result don't really need that much explanation because there's a lot of shared understanding. Let's go down to communication style. There's a lot of indirect communication and vague language used in high context cultural styles. People don't often say directly or say things directly or say exactly what they mean with words. They use indirect language, vague language that might actually have other meanings. They don't use a whole lot of words. A lot of meaning is expressed through inference, through gestures, through silence, even. Feelings are expressed and interpreted often non-verbally. There's a saying in Japanese called read the air, kukio yomu. You don't need to have everything explained to you. You should understand what's going on, read the air. Non-verbal communication is often used, and meaning can be conveyed through status, age, sex, education, family background, title, and affiliation. And let me just give you an example of that one. Let's imagine that we're all Japanese, and so you're Japanese and you have met another Japanese person. Let's just say this person is female, and you met this person in an online group for people who do the same hobby as you. You've never seen this person's face, but she tells you through chat that she's in her first year of studying at university in Japan, and she's Japanese. What do you know about her? Well, most Japanese people will think that she's probably about 18 years old, and she graduated high school just a short time ago, last year. And she's probably not married, and she might live with her parents, or she might live in an apartment near the university, depending on where her home is, her hometown. If she lives in an apartment, she probably lives by herself because Japanese people tend not to have roommates. So because of this shared cultural information and background, there's a lot of information that she doesn't need to explain about herself because other Japanese people can understand these things just by knowing her age, her status as a first-year university student, and things like that. Now, hold on to that information, and we'll look at another example when we go over to low context. In high context cultures, usually it's the listener's responsibility to understand the meaning of the message that's being conveyed. Let's jump over to low context cultures. Some examples are German, Swiss, Scandinavian, North American. These cultures tend to be more heterogeneous. That means they have more diverse backgrounds and experiences. There's been a great change in history and traditions over time. And as a result, conversations and actions need more detailed information. These cultures use a lot of direct communication and use explicit information. It's important to speak up and say what's on your mind in these cultures. It's the words that carry the meaning. And people should explain their ideas and feelings clearly. And also the speaker has the responsibility to make sure that the listener understands the meaning. Now, I gave you the example of homogeneous cultures understanding a lot from just kind of status. Let me give you an opposite example. If you're American, and you meet someone in the United States who tells me they're a first-year university student, an American first-year university student, I really don't know anything else about this person because there's so much diversity in the United States and people come from such varied backgrounds. I need to know more information. She might be any age. She might be my age or older because people go to university at all times of their lives. She might be married or not. She might have children or not. This person might be going back to school after taking a break to raise children, or maybe they want to get more education to start a new career. So because anything could be possible in low context cultures, people need to explain more. So what are some possible misunderstandings between people of high context and low context cultures? Well, we said that, whoops, let me go back. People from high context cultures might think that people who use a lot of verbal communication don't know what they're talking about or are not really that trustworthy, because we said, remember one of those proverbs, people who know do not speak, and people who speak do not know. So maybe it's better to be silent. On the other hand, people in low context cultures where communication and those words are extremely important, they might think people who use vague language or don't speak out directly, maybe they think they don't have an opinion, or maybe they might even think they're holding something back or not trustworthy. So these are possible misunderstandings when we don't understand that cultures have different ways of communicating. Let's look at a different one, collective cultures versus individualistic cultures. Collective cultures, some examples are Japanese culture, Chinese culture, Korean, Arab, Thai, Pakistani, East and West African cultures, among others. Group membership and loyalty is very important. Example is employees in Japan tend to stay with companies for their entire career. It's not as true these days with economic situations, but it's still pretty common. Groups can be families, clubs, hobby groups, schools, universities, companies. The group achieves things together. And social norms are defined by the group. And a person's identity comes from membership in the group. In fact, in Japan, people will often introduce themselves as being a member of some company or a member of a university. So a person from Okayama University might introduce themselves in Japanese as I'm, and say your name. This is my name, and I'm a student at Okayama University. So group membership is important. The person's identity kind of comes from membership in the group, and members are emotionally dependent on the group and the other members of the group. What happens with communication style? Well, it's important to cooperate with the members of the group. As a result, individuals are reluctant to speak out or maybe give differing opinions, opinions that are really different from what the rest of the group thinks. Because disagreement is viewed as disrupting the harmony within the group. And group decision-making by consensus is valued. As a result, decisions may take a long time to reach. On the other hand, in individualistic cultures, and these include North American cultures, British, Australian, Italian, German, South African, and the individual is the most important. Independence is valued, and individual achievement is rewarded. A person's identity comes primarily from themselves, not the group, and a person's goals are more important than loyalty to the group. So if I'm with a company and I decide it would be better if I changed companies or moved to another location, a person from an individualistic culture would be more inclined to do that. or to leave a group, maybe a hobby group, if they feel that their needs just aren't being met. Maybe they'll go and join another hobby group. So people aren't as, aren't very, or maybe definitely not as emotionally dependent on the group. In individualistic cultures, individual decision making is valued. Speaking out in conversations and giving your opinion is encouraged. And disagreement is seen as normal. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's an argument. It's all right to tell someone that you don't agree with them, if you do so in a respectful way. So it's not necessary to reach consensus, and people can agree to disagree. Some possible misunderstandings with culture. People from collective cultures may think that people who speak out and offer differing opinions are not being cooperative. They might think they're being rude. They might think that they're troublemakers. People in individualistic cultures, if we have cultural misunderstanding, they might think that people who don't speak out don't have an opinion. Maybe they'll think they're being rude, or that they're unprepared maybe for class or for the discussion, or maybe they'll think they're not paying attention if they're not speaking out. So when we don't understand that cultures behave in different ways, these are some misunderstandings that can occur. Another one is high and low uncertainty avoidance cultures. And this has to do with how much uncertainty cultures can tolerate. So high uncertainty avoidance, that means, well, we'll get into that. Examples are Japan, Portugal, Greece, Belgium. Characteristics, these kinds of cultures avoid uncertain situations. Unclear or unpredictable situations might cause nervousness. People need clear written rules and plans. And different ideas or behaviors might cause some stress, things that are different from the norm. The communication style, there should be clear planning for meetings, lessons, etc. People may feel highly embarrassed if they give the wrong answer, say in a class, or if they don't know the answer in a class or meetings. And speaking without notes may cause a lot of stress. On the other hand, in low uncertainty avoidance cultures, such as the United States, Finland, Ireland, Sweden, Denmark, these cultures accept uncertainty in life. They feel there should only be as many rules as are necessary. They're not very bothered if every detail is not planned out, and they're not so bothered by different ideas and different people. Communication style, meetings or lessons in which the plan is not explained first are not very bothersome. If there are sudden changes in plans, this doesn't cause very much stress. People in these cultures aren't very concerned about answering incorrectly in class or speaking without notes. Making mistakes is seen as a part of learning, and it's okay to say, I don't know. Here's some possible cultural misunderstandings that can come about. People from high uncertainty avoidance cultures may think that discussions, meetings, or lessons that don't have a set schedule aren't effective. And people from low uncertainty avoidance cultures might think that meetings with or lessons with many rules and a set schedule don't allow people to think or to be creative. Okay, now next I want to talk about some conversation styles of different cultures. An English teacher researcher compared some different conversation styles to 3 sports, bowling, basketball, and rugby. And in these sports, the person with the ball is the person who speaks. So let's look at these, and I want you to think, which sport does your culture play in conversations? The high considerate style cultures practice these types of conversations resemble bowling. In the game of bowling, players take turns in a certain order, and only one person can use the ball at one time. After one person finishes completely, it's the next person's turn. So in bowling conversation style, one speaker speaks at a time. The speaker finishes speaking completely before another person speaks. Senior members usually speak first while junior members wait to speak. So these, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Interrupting or speaking before one's turn is rude. And that's the same in bowling. If you go out of turn, it's kind of bad bowling etiquette. Speakers usually speak slowly and in a low voice. So they're not speaking very loudly. They're not talking over each other. And speakers practice active listening in the form of back channeling. And in Japanese, this is called aizuchi. So when somebody says something, other people will be maybe nodding their heads or going, oh, I see, like that. There are long pauses between speakers. And consensus or agreement and harmony among the speakers is important. And this style of conversation is usually found in cultures with strict hierarchies, such as East Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Thailand, and Switzerland, among others. Let's look at basketball style of conversation. So we need to think about the game of basketball. In a basketball game, one player at a time has the ball. However, that player can pass the ball to other players on the same team, or players from the other team can take the ball when there's a chance. And passing the ball or taking the ball are part of the game, and it keeps the game going. So in this style of conversation, there are short pauses between speakers. One person speaks at a time, but someone else can break in when there's an opportunity. And this interruption is not seen as rude because it moves the conversation forward. And this style is common in the US, Britain, Canada, Australia, and other places. And the last one is called high involvement style. And this resembles a game of rugby. So in rugby, there is a lot going on. It's a full contact sport. It's rough, it's loud, it's active. People pile up on top of one another. There are arms and legs all over the place. You can steal the ball right out of someone else's hands. In this conversation style, many people speak at the same time. There's a lot of overlap and interruption. As a result, conversations can be quite loud and exciting. People interrupt each other a lot, but this is not considered rude. In fact, you're expected to interrupt each other, and other people expect to be interrupted. And because of all this interruption, the speakers and topics change very quickly. Cultures that practice this style of speaking include Middle Eastern cultures, some African cultures, Southern European cultures such as Italy, Spain, and Greece, Latin American cultures, and Russia. So think, why is it important to know that different cultures have different conversation styles? What situations could this information be important? Think about how you could apply that to your own practice or situations. I want you to, let's go back to the chat. Don't go to the Google Doc, go to the chat. And I want you to type in really quickly, which conversation style, bowling, basketball, or rugby, does your culture practice, or which one are you most comfortable in? Just type the sport into the chat. I see basketball, bowling, basketball. Any rugby players here? Bowling, let's see. Maybe, depends on the context I'm in, but I think I'm most comfortable with basketball. Yeah. Yeah, so we might be able to switch back and forth. I think the rugby style is fascinating, but I don't know how well I can roll with it. I'm more of a basketball person. We've got another basketball. Okay, thanks for that. Let's continue on. We're almost finished. So here's some points to remember. Not all people in a culture fit all of these descriptions that I gave exactly. Everyone is different. For example, some Japanese people are very comfortable using the basketball or rugby models, and some Americans prefer to listen more than speak. It might not be possible to always know where someone we are communicating with is from. What's important is that we understand and accept that people from different cultures communicate differently. Let me move my chat box. I mentioned at the beginning how interconnected we've become. This doesn't only apply to the virtual situation due to COVID-19. Human migration due to climate change and disasters, poverty, war, etc., is at an all-time high, and we must begin addressing intercultural competence in a more direct way. I'm going to make some assertions about what I think should be happening with intercultural communication and competence education. First, intercultural communication and competence must be explicitly taught, I think. Sometimes it's thought that simply putting people together, putting people of different cultures together in some way, like in communities or on university campuses, will naturally lead to intercultural understanding. But researchers have been looking into this, and they've found that this isn't necessarily the case. And so students at universities don't necessarily learn intercultural communication and understanding on their own just by being put together by other international students. And misunderstandings remain a struggle. So case in point, when I've been in university classes in Japan with mixture of international students and Japanese students, the international students were mostly from Europe and North America. Some comments that I heard and read from the students were like this. So from the European and North American students, they would say things like, Japanese students don't speak out, they don't contribute to the conversation, they just sit there and it's like they don't have their own opinions. It sounds similar to those misunderstandings we looked at. And the Japanese students said things like, the international students dominate the conversation, I can't get a word in. And these were international students who had been in Japan for at least several months already. And these were Japanese students who had spent quite a bit of time in the same classes with foreign students. So just being in contact doesn't mean that they were automatically able to understand each other's behavior. And Hoffmeyer found that structured programs work better. She found that in universities, when intercultural communication and understanding programs were led by teachers or staff, there were much better outcomes. From a social studies teacher's perspective, I believe that intercultural communication and competence should be taught as part of the regular social studies curriculum, at least by high school. Usually students don't get these, junior high and high school students don't usually get these concepts in social studies classes unless they happen to take an elective that touches on them. And the same is true at the university undergraduate level. Most students are unlikely to encounter these concepts unless it's by chance in an elective course. And I really think it needs to be worked in more to the core curriculum somehow so that we get a broader understanding of this. Some people may say, well, why not just teach it in international programs? Well, that's a good idea too, and that's great for students who are going abroad, but what about the students at the receiving schools? International students don't just come and hang out with only international students. They hang out and take classes with the general student body. And if the incoming international students at a university have explicit knowledge of intercultural competence and communication, but most of the general student body doesn't, that doesn't help matters all that much. So that's my opinion on intercultural communication and competence education. So just a few takeaways. It's not really just enough to study the language of another culture. It's not enough just to study or know about another culture's objective culture, the things in the culture. We need to have knowledge of subjective culture, their viewpoints and ideas, and that includes communication styles. Okay, to wrap this up, I'd like to connect intercultural competence and communication to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. I think the most obvious connections would be to SDG 4, ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning. SDG 10, reducing inequality within and among countries. SDG 11, making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Number 16, promoting peaceful, inclusive societies, access to justice for all. And number 17, strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnerships for sustainable development. Keywords here are inclusive, reducing inequality, and strengthening and revitalizing. However, I'm going to argue that intercultural communication and competence are connected to all of the SDGs. The reason I say this is because a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals deal with helping others or giving aid, especially to developing nations in order to achieve the goals. And this is not a bad thing, but we have to keep some things in mind when we are interacting with these other cultures. And I'm going to tell you a story that a former international school colleague told me that he had been told about a service learning project that a different international school in Japan had undertaken in a village in Thailand. So for most of the school year, at this international school, the kids and the parents were raising money to help this village school in Thailand. And things got quite competitive, as a matter of fact, and they raised a lot of money. And with the money, they bought and installed really nice playground equipment for the kids at the school in the village in Thailand. But when they went back to Thailand to visit the school in the village a year later, the playground equipment was gone. And the school had sold it and used the money to go toward repairing the roof, which is what they really needed. And the problem was nobody ever asked them what they needed. They just gave them what they thought they needed. The playground equipment was certainly donated with good intentions. However, too often aid or help is given from a position of what others, especially those from developed nations, think is needed or should be done for others. And the truth is that people in need usually have a very good idea and understanding of what they need and why they need it. So it's important to value and to listen to local knowledge within cultural context about everything from poverty issues to ecosystem management and everything in between, everything that's covered by the SDGs, in fact. And we can do this by developing intercultural competence and communication skills. And in this way, we can go a long way toward making the SDGs truly sustainable and effective. And this concludes my talk. I'll show you my references slides, and then I'm gonna stop the share. And if you've got any questions, please let me know. I think you can open your microphones or use the chat. Shauna says in the chat, she asked me, how do you bring conversations of intercultural communication and competence into your classroom when speaking about human rights and diversity within Japan? Wow. I'm trying to think of how I've mixed the two. And actually, talking about the SDGs would be a perfect, what I just said about the SDGs, I think that would be a great way. I haven't had a chance to talk about that in class specifically yet, but talking about understanding what other cultures need based on their culture, not our culture, and what we think we need, I think would be a good way to talk about human rights. Because if we're really not, if we say that we're trying to help someone, people, and that's the goal of the SDGs, to restore, to maintain people's human rights, we've got to be able to listen to them. So this is a great way to blend that. Let me see. Thank you. Okay, so John says, a comment about my last story about donating to Thailand. Sakamoto Tatsu, who cycled around the world, wanted to give something back to African country who helped him, so he brought medicine, but they were disappointed because he didn't ask them what they needed. It turned out that what they really wanted was a well for clean drinking water to address the source of the children's illness, right? Not just the medicine to treat it, but to the clean water so that the children weren't getting sick in the first place. So he then volunteered to build a well for them. No question, just a comment. Okay, yeah, that's a perfect example. And it apparently somehow, maybe I don't know if they expressed their disappointment directly or how it came to his knowledge that that's not what they really were hoping for or what they really needed, but he got the message, and he realized that what these people really needed was something else, and then he did it. And so we need to be open-minded and resilient and flexible and ready to listen. Thank you. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Any other questions, comments, stories that you know, experiences?
Okay, it seems to me it's about time to wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Kambara sensei.
Thank you very much.
It was very interesting and informative presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you again. Thank you very much.